Flora McLachlan is a Welsh-based printmaker for this symposium. She is a member of Oxford Printmakers, Aberystwyth Printmakers, and a member of the Royal Society of Painter Printmakers. Flora has been making prints for over 20 years and is currently working on an MA at Aberystwyth University in printmaking. Like our other symposium artist, Flora uses the etching technique masterly, achieving a mystical, enchanted quality in the prints that is quite unique. So please, enjoy this wonderful talk by Flora.
Hello, I'm Flora McLachlan, and I'm going to start this talk by giving you a little walk around of my workshop. I'm afraid it's in a terrible mess because I've just had an exhibition which is on at the moment at Sarah Wiseman Gallery. It's called The Wood Between the Worlds, if you want to have a look. And also it's terribly disarranged because we are building shelves for my litho stones at the moment. So everything's being pushed and piled out of the way. So there are lots of things on top of other things at the moment. So here we go. I'm standing just inside the door and I'm gazing at my large etching press. My shelves of paraphernalia, potions, solvents, inks, my aquatin box, and a little room by itself which is going to have a curtain eventually. And the stone shelves we're building at the moment to put my litho stones in. There are stones everywhere, lying around on the floor and piled up under each press. Here's a stone lying on my little litho press, which I'm working on at the moment. Framing paraphernalia. At the end here is my large litho press, which we've just been mending the bed of because it was slightly dished. And more litho stones underneath it. Wash out sink, stone grinding corner. And the inking up hot plate. Rack for etching plates. I guess my work is mostly about a sense of enchantment, really, looking into my past experiences of fairy tales, magic, that whole world of being transfixed by a story. So that when I see anything now like briars or brambles, I can't help thinking of Sleeping Beauty and knights riding through the forest and a whole hidden world of something behind these simple stems with thorns on. Many echoes and poetic resonances which I'm trying to bring across when I make work. I think there's something about moving to a new place that really makes you want to examine who you are, where you've come from and where you're going. This large etching here is called All Shall Be Well, and it's one of the first big etchings I made when I moved to Wales. It shows a person, probably me, emerging from a river, washing ritually washing her face. And in the middle of this, it's embracing landscape. The rushes are bending round, the trees are kind of huddling towards the figure, and everything is a sort of enveloping, magical atmosphere. Of course, that's something I really want to happen, but it's very hard to feel that when you have just transplanted yourself from one place and moved to a different country, Wales, of course. So this concern with immersion in the landscape has always been at the heart of my work, and I think it started off as a kind of ideal dream of a connection with nature and a moment of wonder, but it's now grown into looking into the feeling of immersion and where it comes from, where it can be found. And I think I've started to combine the appearance of landscape with thinking about why certain landscapes make you feel a certain way. And I think it's all tied up in my case with literary symbols. The literary motif of the dark, impenetrable forest is one that I encountered while I was doing my degree in Oxford. I did English, and I was really interested in the form of the medieval romance and anything Arthurian. I loved Gawain in The Green Knight. Because of this extraordinary motif of the forest, which appears as a place of wildness, chaos and transformation. If someone leaves home and goes into a forest, you know that something magical is about to happen. So entering the wilderness becomes this magical journey through the looking glass into a world of fairy logic and the inexplicable. So it's that aspect of the forest as a doorway to another world, a conscious transformation into the realm of the weird and the eerie that fascinates me. To push through the brambles and under the boughs is to make a ritual entry into the domain of story. As a child, I used to read the Andrew Lang blue and yellow fairy books obsessively, and I think those stories inform my whole imaginative life. For me, the entry into the forest also functions on a spiritual level. You enter somewhere dark, dangerous and unknowable and emerge transformed. So last year during lockdown, I started thinking about which of these myths I'd read as a child resonate most within me. I started to think about my interaction with the collective unconscious underpinning everything. And I read some Jung and started to engage with the fairy tales I remembered and question their narratives and pull them around a bit. It was definitely a search for the self, an attempt to place myself within the world. Something I really personally felt the need of after moving to Wales and in the last 10 years losing my parents as well. And of course with that losing the countryside where I grew up as somewhere I could easily visit. It's like you lose your stamping ground, really. For the last 2 years, I've been doing a fine art MA at Aberystwyth. So I started with the intention of putting aside my usual way of working and experimenting with lots of techniques completely new to me. I wanted to give myself the time and the space to fail, really. Because when you sell your art for a living, it's hard to shed the mindset that everything you make must work. It must be desirable and saleable. You think it won't affect you, but it always does affect what you make, increasingly, I think, as you go on. So I really felt I needed to leave my well-trodden path and venture into the spiky undergrowth of the fairy tale forest, in technique as well as in subject matter. So I knew I'd get a bit scratched and torn and things probably wouldn't work out straight away, but I think it was a really necessary adventure for me. So I'm going to read a little bit from one of the medieval romances that describes the start of a quest. They set forth from the castle and departed now, one from another, and they went into the forest, one here, one there, wherever they saw that it was thickest, and wherever there was neither path nor track. So that was my mission statement for the MA work, really. So to enter my pathless wilderness, I started working on aluminium plates, which are so much cheaper than copper. I used a lot of spit bite on them, where you just paint on the etch and it flows about. You can move it around with a paintbrush, really immediate. And I used white ground, which is a semi-permeable ground. That is, it's not a complete stop out. It lets the acid gradually through to the plate as the bite goes on. So I made that out of soap and oil and white pigment. I also used ink from other etching plates as a resist, offset onto the plate through the press, and then lightly aquatinted and bitten. And I also used oil pastel as a stop out. I wanted to keep things really simple and fluid and not aim for a known effect, which I've become really good at over the years, but to take whatever came to me and just run with that. I wanted to bring back the adventure into my work. So this image is part of the making of an etching called The Witch's Hut, which is one of those places of testing and transformation you might encounter in the forest. It has 5 plates, and I had the idea that each plate would be used to make a further print, so that the 5 plates would expand outwards into multiple pathways, which I would make myself through the undergrowth. So the plate on the left is the first plate I made, the key line plate, and I offset that onto another plate and bit the traces of ink. And because aluminium is so sensitive to grease, it made a really delicate cobwebby impression, which I was really pleased with. So in the next slide, you can see I've added sheen colle and block prints pasted on to make a different image. So it's become a kind of chapel perilous, a kind of ritual place in the middle of the forest. And in the next one, I've used it to express another magical motif from medieval romance, which is the grafted tree, a hybrid tree, 2 types of fruit trees grafted together. In these stories, it seems to act as an intersection with a weird fairy otherworld, and so I've grafted that together out of other etchings and lithographs. So the plate becomes a more elastic thing. It starts to become, people call their printing plates a matrix, so which is of course means a womb. So the plate becomes a place of origin instead of a full stop in my head, I think. So I'm seeing its reproductive power as an artistic freedom instead of just a commercial device. So here are some more colour studies from adding the plates in sequence. Putting on the oil pastel and painting on the white ground was a very instinctive thing to do, so it was a bit like painting, the process of making this plate, and dipping it richly into the bath of copper sulphate. I wanted the process to become more magical, and it did feel like that with the intention. This did actually happen. So there's a spit bite plate with grease all over the plate so that it beads and runs, and that leaves really interesting marks. A close-up of the colours. I wanted to bite the plate really deeply so that the colours stand out. So I have a real mixture of deeply bitten and light spit bites there. And there's the final print, The Witch's Hut. So from that first intention to make the way of working more magical, that's developed up till the present day, when I've actually found myself inventing rituals and performing fairy tale events, making and wearing masks and costumes, trying to make myself a magical connection through the wild into the collective unconscious. Shortly after finishing that etching, I went away for a whole month in November 2019 for a residency at Studio Mylor in North Wales, which is an amazing opportunity to get away from my family and really concentrate, have an uninterrupted stream of thought for a whole month, which was an incredible gift. So I'll show you a few pictures of the magic of Corris. It's surrounded by wooded mountains, so you get the sense that there's the village and surrounding it there's this mythological dark forest. So I really wanted to express an imaginary interaction between the village and the forest brooding above it. So in the next slide there's a view from the riverbed looking up through undergrowth. You can just see lights from the village shining through the tree trunks, and it's very misty. The mist comes down very quickly. There's a bridge covered in a curtain of ivy, a golden tree, a white pillar of a waterfall, a mossy fountain grotto with a chain in it, and there's actually an Italian village miniature built into the hillside in one place. There's a little fountain head from it there. The graveyard with various interesting gravestones. And it's a very cloudy place. There's lots of clouds drifting in shreds through the trees, the chimney smoke coming up from the chimneys. It's very airy and elemental. And of course I didn't know the history or origin of any of these things, and that was quite important. I wanted to try and sense or imagine a mythology, be a sort of archaeologist of a silent, deserted place, as if there was nobody living there. And of course it is a bit like that when you come to somewhere and you don't know anybody there. You're on your own and you have to make what you can of things. So there's a picture of my studio there in the attic. I was listening a lot to Richard Dawson, his amazing album, The Magic Bridge, especially the song There's a Black Dog in the Sky. So I was listening to that over and over again, and for me that was adding a mythical dimension to what I was doing. It was kind of maddening the imagination. I really love to work to music. It really stimulates random interesting connections for me. I use a lot of Led Zeppelin, but unfortunately for anyone else within earshot, I do have to repeat the same song over and over again while I'm painting. I also have a tape of nothing but a live version of Lost in the Forest by The Cure to paint to. So while listening to this music, I was painting a lot of studies in black ink with giant dogs swirling about in the sky and stalking the streets. I'll show you close-ups of the drawings. This was the dawn of my work with ritual and folklore and imagined myths, but I just didn't know how to pull it together back then. The dog was certainly a symbol of folklore being there, but it wasn't yet my folklore. It was so when I started working on this, these images, I was drawing onto the stone, and I find when I draw on a litho stone, I can't. So when I was drawing the lithograph, I concentrated on the smoke from the chimneys and the rushing river that divides the village, and the mist and the stars. And I've called it hearth fires, and that's about 70 by 60 centimetres, a very large stone. Also at Corris there was a wood. The next slide shows the sign showing when it was planted, which is 1973, so about the time I was conceived the wood was planted. So I found that very significant, that the wood was kind of like me. So I decided when I got back home to start doing some more work on the separate plates of the witch's hut and combining them with gestural studies of the woodlands from the sketches I'd made in Mylor. So I started making these gestures, painting on the white ground with a pine branch, and trying to think myself into being alone in the forest and watching it move. But as you can see you can see the next few slides, I made a lot of studies layering these gestural plates. Some of them are 5 or 6 or 7 plates, all layered. And hunting through, I would describe this stage of making work as getting completely tangled up in the undergrowth. I didn't quite know where I was going. I felt the prints seemed to be hiding something. They didn't have a clear message. I mean, my intention had been to get lost, and I think that is expressed in the prints, definitely. So there was something hiding in all these branches. I was making work describing the possibility of seeing a vision on this quest, but in the prints I wasn't seeing the vision. So I was a bit stumped, really. Luckily, I had another residency coming up. I'd been invited to go and stay at the Graphic Verkstan, Gods Magasinet, I probably said that completely wrong, which is in Sweden, run by Lars Nyberg. There he is next to the wonderful large etching press, and Lena Nordstrom. And they very kindly showed me how to make dry points in Lars's beautiful, special, delicate way. Of course, it's in the middle of a forest, so it was like a dream for me, a print shop in a forest. And it was actually quite overwhelming because the trees went on and on. So I started to focus on tiny details. The forest floor was very rich, full of miniature forests of lichen, and I took many close-up pictures, like this one here, with little clumps of lichen, seemingly troll houses. I just started to go completely miniature, and so I made a work that's called Troll House. It's similar to the Witch's Hut in composition, but much smaller, and you have a slightly more fairy-like impression of the portal there. It's softer, more organic, not toothed anymore. That led on to my saving grace, really, a moment of inspiration. And the next slide shows a grab from my photographs, and you can see I've been photographing moss, and then suddenly I get the idea to photograph tiny details from all those chaotic gestural forest prints that I had been making and pinning up and staring at in desperation, and just looking for what they suggested to me, these very miniature scenes. And all these mythical ideas started to emerge. It's along the lines of Emil Nolder's series of etchings, which I've got a picture of here. This is Spooks, where he's just making textures on the etching plate and then just scrying into the marks to see what shapes he can pick out. And all these strange imaginative personages come out, really misshapen, odd creatures. And I loved that approach. So I started to do the same thing with these little tiny pieces of matter that I had grabbed from my larger etchings. So here's a little thumbnail in the left, and on the right there's my pen and ink drawing. I started to see the witch's hut in that, and bonfires, and the fence made of bones. So I painted that composition onto a copper plate. I should explain, this is when, as soon as I returned from Sweden, the first lockdown started. So I had to just start working on whatever I had in my workshop at home. So I had a few aluminium plates, but luckily I had some copper I'd managed to get from the art school before the big lockdown. So I started to work on that. So I did choose some familiar things to work on. So here's the white ground brushed on thinly, and I've been scratching into it with cotton buds. And there's the first proof from it, the next slide. And on the right-hand side, I noticed a face emerging it's about halfway down the image. You can just see a nose and eyes faintly. And I didn't intend that to be there. So this woman appeared, and I made some sketches on the proofs. And I made her a bit clearer. And it's as if it was almost like myself coming into the print, or somebody exploring their way through the mythical forest on a journey to confront Baba Yaga in her little hut on the chicken leg, which you can see in the distance. And this just made the whole thing come alive suddenly, and I realised that I had tapped into that mythical story which expressed what was going on in the journey into the forest, how this archetypal quest meant a lot to me, and how it told the story of a human life, really. So I started to be very excited about this, scratching into the copper, burnishing to bring out the details. It was like it was all unfolding out of the surface of the plate, and there's the final print, the bone gate. I think the title tries to express that there is a gate made of human bones. That's the part of the terror of Baba Yaga. But a bone gate can also refer to the process of being born, perhaps, when you pass through the pelvis. So it expresses the fact that the hint that this is a spiritual rebirth, going through the ordeal and being transformed. So if we're talking about journeys into the forest feminine, Baba Yaga is the ultimate representation of that. She is the horror at the heart of the pathless forest. She's a destructive power. I feel she could be seen as a kind of goddess of etching, because you have to destroy the plate surface in order to create your image. So I think that also expresses another aspect of Baba Yaga, which is that she is a necessary force. Death and life must be balanced. Things must be destroyed for new things to come into being. So she's not all bad. She is necessary. So my sister and I were applying for an online residency themed supernatural women in November 2020. And we chose Baba Yaga, the bony-legged, the witch, for our inspiration. And we wanted to celebrate the magic of our processes, really investigate the material rituals we use to make our art, to kind of make the process magical again, to step back from it and experience the beauty of it. So in the story, the heroine ventures into the forest, finding signs or tokens along the way: a loaf of bread, a handkerchief, a ribbon, a comb. We wrote these significant objects from the tales down, and we drew one each at random from a bag every morning to inform that day's work. I wanted my work to be found along the way by chance, so I found some plates I'd inherited years before from another printmaker. They were grounded, but they were really scratched and scarred. On the next slide there's a picture of this plate as I found it in my storage cupboard. And one had a piece of muslin stuck to it. So I etched those into the plates. The next slide shows the 4 plates with their random marks etched into them, and the words that were chosen out of the bag attached to each one. So the first one is the hut. There's a faint peaked hut shape at the bottom, and then in the bread one there's a black fleck which might be a loaf of bread on the forest path. Loom I drew from the bag, and that obviously had to go with the cloth piece one, and then handkerchief by process of elimination went with the last one. So I started to apply the white ground to the plates again and dream these images out of those scratched marks. And the next plate shows the first proof of the hut plate. They're very small, like that. There's the hut plate. And I reached the final image by just scratching away at the ground blur, and I wanted them to be really, really ambiguous. So I didn't want things to be too clear, too illustrative. So in this one I feel happy there's just a suggestion of someone approaching through the trees and this rather ramshackle witch's hut standing in a clearing. And the next in the series is the bread, which shows the forest and the little loaf of bread lying on the path. On the bread day, I also we went on a ritual walk every morning as part of this residency, and I decided to make myself a mask out of a slice of bread. So I cut eye holes in it and tied it on and walked round our little wood. And it was extraordinary how the eye holes, I could hardly see through them, and they really reduced my view of the wood to an essence, just an essential snippet, little thumbnails of the wood, which were, so I felt I could have been in any wood. It turned it into a kind of archetypal wood, which was really, really fascinating. And then I carried that on by dipping my mask into white ground and applying that to an etching plate, and then biting that in, which created this lovely ambiguous shape, slightly forest looking, which I haven't worked out how to use yet, but I printed it in black and also yellow, and so that'll be another branch to explore at some point. And the next slide shows the third image, which is, the word was loom on that day. So I've put Baba Yaga's face looming through her homespun curtain, and on the other side is the young girl gathering the birch twigs together with the ribbon round her wrist, which she uses to tie them up. And this is the kind of the point of confrontation. So this division down the centre of the plate, I feel, shows the contrast between the gathering and binding that the young girl does and the destructive force of Baba Yaga on the other side. So this is the crux of the story for me. And to me, birch twigs are really significant. Obviously, I gather the kindling every day, and that's something I use to connect me to the outside world. So all these beautiful colours in the twigs, the maroons and silvers and browns, they just really make me feel like I'm part of everything. But also I find them really symbolic. And it's this gathering and binding, for me, is the essence of creative endeavour. So I took this theme into painting, and in this next slide you can see one of my paintings on this theme. And the idea is that this handful of matter is what you're using to get to grow into yourself, really. This is what your power is. It's the moment when you see how you're going to interact with matter how you're going to interact with the world, what you are going to gather and bind together in your life. So it's, in a way, it's your fairy tale task. It's not easy. You know, might be put in a stone room and told by the king to spin straw into gold. It's like that. But that is also your moment of power. So it's when you leave home. The next slide shows another painting called Forest Transformation, which is, and there's a little graphic there I drew before painting it, which shows that the forest in the centre is a kind of liman. It's a portal to another world. So when you leave home and pass through that forest, you're passing into your opportunity to gather and bind things together to become your creative self. And next slide shows the whole series together, which I called Fairy Tale, and I titled them as a series of commands. So it's a kind of instruction book for how to move through the myth. So the story continues into lithography. Having reached that idea of putting yourself in the myth and looking at things through the wobbly glass pane of the forest, that finally released the series of large lithographs about the village of Corris and its imaginary myth, which had stalled back in 2019. lithography is such a magical process itself. The idea that you can make this drawing on the stone, and then by the through the alchemy of grease and water, you can roll ink onto it and just print from this completely flat surface, print your drawing, is wonderful, wonderful to see. I have a little video here showing a print being peeled off, and it is like a magical spell, the way it appears. So I started off working imaginatively with Chorus, not looking at the sketches anymore. I just started to work with whatever images sprang to mind. So we have my fairy tale preoccupations with the mound of briars and a person in isolation within, horse spirits rising out of the water, which eventually evolved into this image called Mythos, which is again a large stone lithograph. And the black dog has appeared back in the sky, and he's raining onto this parade of strange characters underneath him. So it's kind of imagining the inner life of the village that I had no idea about, but I started to wonder about how it might manifest itself. And the next lithograph, I went down into the riverbed in my imagination, and within the brushstrokes, all sorts of magical creatures started to appear, sorceresses and otters and various shape-shifting people. And above it all the dark hills and the starry sky. So I've put some process pictures of how the drawing developed in, and eventually, after a few days of drawing, reached the final image. Along the way, it was very interesting how, because I started with a very loose wash of crayon mixed with meths, how these random shapes formed, and again I was able to look into them and see what developed, as the otters weren't planned. I just managed to turn the shapes into them, so it felt, by scratching away as well. So as I was doing it, I started thinking of native rock art and the kind of ritual action of scraping out these spirit animals. So it felt similar. It's amazing the trance you go into when you're drawing, or I do anyway. And because this was at the School of Art, there wasn't any Led Zeppelin involved. It was just coffee. So that was Shapeshifters. And the next slide shows a sketch for the fourth image in the series, which is called Spells. And again, I'm starting to remember the fairy tales. There are hints of the Goose Girl in there. There's the horse's head stuck above the gate. And the next slide, you can see the little horse's head above the city gate, and the female figure gathering nettles, which is a reference to the wild swans, where the princess has to... No, I don't think she's a princess at that stage. Anyway, she ends up being married to a king, but she has to gather nettles and spin 12 shirts for her brothers to break the spell that has turned them into swans. So I'm still thinking of the fairy tale tasks and working them into these dreamy images, which are somehow combining to make the atmosphere of this Welsh village. When I'm printing a lithograph, I like to ink it up gradually a little bit more, so the storms of ink just gather over the surface, getting slightly darker. If you look at the original drawing on the stone of Spells and then the actual print on the right, you can see that the tones have become more shadowy. So I take it to that point and then quickly stop it and etch it again and lay it by and edition the stone in a couple of weeks, just so the filling in doesn't carry on. So I love the way it has its own alchemy, really. You can get this atmosphere which can't appear in the drawing, but you can take it a little bit further just by the action of the ink. The last piece of work I want to talk about is called Acting Out the Goose Girl. So I took one of my print plate cleaning rags and dropped 3 drops of red printing ink on it. I was going to walk up the stream with that, and this is acting out the story of the goose girl who had the rag with 3 drops of her mother's blood on it, and when she bent over a stream to drink, the rag fell off and drifted away down the river, and when that happened she lost her protection, and her serving maid was able to steal her clothes and her horse and take her place. So she was forced to herd geese in the fields behind the palace instead of marrying the prince. So obviously this loss of mother's protection really resonates with me, and so I thought I would act it out. So I went up the little stream and I released the rag, and the idea was to let it drift down and see where it stopped. But it just kept stopping. It caught all the time on tussocks, and I kept having to free it. So the interesting thing about doing these rituals is that you never know what's going to happen, and new things turn up in the doing of them to make you think further about all the meaning behind the myth and reality and what you can create into it. So here's a picture of the rag stuck in the stream. When I went back the next morning, there it was, flapping in the stream. And I'm imagining this myth in terms of a release from the pattern. It's not just a losing of protection, it's also a freedom from a restrictive pattern, because it's, you've left home, the mother's power is no longer over you. So I've also approached this in paint, and I've painted the goose girl's feet up on the hill in the sunshine and the wind, with her bare feet in the grass, and I'm seeing it as a kind of freedom. She doesn't have to marry this prince she has never met. I've put a crown tattoo on her leg to show that it's quite hard to escape from these patterns, but that maybe the story could have ended there and it would be happier than the ending that's in all the books. So the barefoot motif for me it's a symbol of being connected to the essence of life, really. I find myself using barefoot ritual walks to try and break through the surface film into thinking of a freer and more magical way of being and working. So I'm going to leave you with a video of the rag, which is now trapped in the stream at the very top of our top field. And there it has stuck through many floods and violent storms, and the rushing river still hasn't dislodged it. But what I've got out of that is this image of the fabric underwater. It's actually really beautiful. It looks like an old master painting in some lights. And the images that's triggering off are something I'm going to work with. So instead of seeing that as a kind of stuckness, I'm seeing that as something I've been given to work with. So thank you very much for listening to my print narrative with all its branches and its obscured paths and its spiny undergrowth. And if you want to look at any of the prints in more detail, they are on my website, or they're also in a beautiful catalogue that's been made for my solo exhibition, which is on at the Sarah Wiseman Gallery at the moment. And the link to that is in my Instagram profile at Flora McLachlan. And it's also on the Sarah Wiseman Gallery website if you want to have a look without me whisking them away before you're ready. So thank you very much for listening.